He didn't even look up. Derivative. Elada. Utterly lacking in soul. Maestro Julian Thorne slid my score back across his vast mahogany desk. The desk was a legendary piece of furniture, rumored to have been a gift from a 19th century monarch. It was also, at that moment, a barrier separating his world of power from my world of, well, noise. On my side of the desk sat a manuscript of 500 pages, a piece I had poured 2 solid years of my life into blank. On his side, a small, porcelain cup of espresso and a hand that conducted the most powerful orchestra in the country. Maestro. I started, my voice betraying a tremor that I absolutely despised. If you would just look at the third movement, the brass arrangement, he interrupted, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were not cruel. They were just empty, indifferent. The brass arrangement is irrelevant when the foundation is flawed. It is noise. Elada, talented noise. Perhaps, but noise nonetheless. I flinched. Noise. 2 years of sleepless nights, of missed birthdays, of pouring every single cent I earned from my measly assistant's salary into composition software. All of it, reduced to noise. I understand. I lied. My throat felt tight, thick with a frustration I couldn't swallow. No, I don't believe you do. He stood up. A tall, imposing figure in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than my apartment's security deposit. He walked to the grand, floor-to-ceiling window of his office, which overlooked the bustling plaza of Lincoln Center. He was the king of this entire domain. Music. My dear, he said, clasping his hands behind his back, is not about effort. It is about genius. And genius is rare. He turned back, a thin, patronizing smile playing on his lips. As it happens, the board has approved my recommendation. We will be premiering a new work at the Winter Gala, a piece of true vision. My heart, stupidly, gave a small, pathetic leap. Had he reconsidered? Was this some kind of bizarre test? I am so pleased to announce, he continued, that the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra will be debuting the first major symphony from Sebastian Thorne. The name hit me like a physical blow. Sebastian. His son. Sebastian, who couldn't analyze a score by Debussy without his father's help. Sebastian, whose idea of complex harmony was just playing 2 minor chords at the same time. Sebastian, who was, at that very moment, probably struggling to get his bow to bite the strings on a simple scale. His symphony, I managed to say, but he's still at Juilliard. Genius, Thorne said, his smile widening. It answers to no timeline. His work is transcendent. It will be a remarkable debut. He glanced back at my score on his desk. My 500 pages of noise. That will be all. Elada, please send in the new intern on your way out. And do try to simplify your ideas. Perhaps a jingle. I hear there is good money in jingles. I picked up my manuscript. The weight of it felt immense. A tombstone for my hopes. I walked to the door, my footsteps silent on the plush Persian rug that probably cost more than my car. I paused, my hand on the heavy brass handle. You're right, Maestro, I said, my voice suddenly very clear, very cold. He looked up, surprised I had spoken. It is derivative, I said, holding up the score. I copied it directly from a first-year student workbook on basic counterpoint. I just wanted to see if you would even bother to read past page 1. His face, for the first time, registered an emotion, a flicker of dark, offended surprise. You didn't. I continued. You didn't read it at all. You just saw my name. I opened the door. But don't worry, I said, looking back at him. The piece I'm actually working on. You'll never see it coming. I walked out, leaving him in his silent, soulless office. And I didn't look back. The war had begun. My name is Alara Vance. For 5 years. I had been the junior assistant to the assistant conductor at the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra. It was, as my parents proudly told their friends back in Ohio, a dream job. In reality, it meant I fetched coffee. I corrected typos in press releases. I booked Maestro Julian Thorne's travel arrangements and ensured his preferred brand of sparkling water, Fjord Sparkle, the one imported from a specific, infuriatingly obscure Norwegian fjord, was always stocked in his private fridge. And, worst of all, it meant I had a front row seat to watch Sebastian Thorne fail upwards. I had arrived in New York 10 years prior, with a full scholarship to Juilliard and a portfolio that had made my professors weep. You are the next great voice. Elada, my mentor, Dr. Eris, had told me upon graduation, his hand on my shoulder, do not let them silence you. But New York is a city that runs on connections, not just talent. Julian Thorne ran the Metropolitan, and by extension, he ran the classical music scene on the East Coast. To get a piece performed by the Met was to be anointed, so I took the assistant job. I told myself it was getting a foot in the door. I told myself I would learn the system. I would watch. And I watched. I watched as Thorne dismissed brilliant, challenging works from female composers and artists of color, favoring the same tired rotation of long-dead European men. I watched as he systematically undermined his assistant conductors, ensuring none of them ever shone brightly enough to be seen as a potential rival. And I watched him groom his son, Sebastian. Sebastian Thorne was a perfectly nice, utterly mediocre violinist. He had his father's height and his mother's limp. Expensive-looking hair, but none of their talent. His playing was technically adequate but emotionally sterile. His compositions, which he'd been workshopping at Juilliard, were simplistic, saccharine, and tragically boring. Yet, he was the heir apparent. He was given master classes. He was unfit to teach. He was granted solo opportunities in minor concerts, where his weak playing was carefully hidden by a bolstered string section. I remembered one rehearsal. Just last year, Sebastian was attempting a solo from a Tchaikovsky piece. He was struggling with a complex run, his intonation slipping, his bowing frantic and scratching. The entire orchestra was wincing. Thorne stopped the rehearsal. He didn't correct his son. He turned to the concertmaster, a brilliant woman named Maria, who had been playing for 30 years. Maria, he said, his voice quiet but carrying, your section is dragging. You are throwing him off. Fix it. Maria, who had been playing the part perfectly, just closed her eyes for a single, long-suffering second. She nodded. Yes, Maestro. That was the day my respect for Julian Thorne died. It was the day I realized the system wasn't just flawed, it was rotten, and Thorne was the source of the rot. My test with the derivative score had proven my hypothesis. He wasn't a guardian of genius. He was a gatekeeper of his own ego. He hadn't even read my work. He just saw my name, the name of his assistant, and dismissed it. He had no idea who I really was. He had no idea what I was capable of. I went home to my tiny Brooklyn apartment, the one with the rattling radiator and the view of a brick wall. I pulled out a fresh stack of manuscript paper. I logged into the secure Daction, encrypted hard drive I kept hidden in a fireproof safe under my bed. It was time to finish my real symphony. the piece I had been secretly composing for 3 years. A piece so complex, so angry, so beautiful. It would either destroy me or make me. I called it the Crimson Tempest. And I knew exactly how to get Julian Thorne to play it. The plan was audacious. It was insane, and it was the only way. Maestro Julian Thorne was lazy. He was arrogant. But his greatest sin, his most exploitable weakness, was his blind ambition for his son. He didn't just want Sebastian to succeed. He wanted him to be seen as a genius, a prodigy, a reflection of Julian's own greatness. And I was going to use that. The American Grand Composer's Prize was the most prestigious award for new classical music in the nation. It was the Oscars and the Pulitzers of the symphony world, all rolled into one. The deadline was in 2 months, and this year, the head of the judging panel was, of course, Maestro Julian Thorne. For the next 8 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Alara, the perfectly pleasant, slightly dim assistant. I fetched Thorne's Norwegian water. I complimented Sebastian on his new terrible bow tie. I smiled, and I nodded, and I made myself completely invisible. By night, I was a fury. I locked myself in my apartment. I didn't sleep. I lived on black coffee and sheer, unadulterated rage. The Crimson Tempest poured out of me. It wasn't just music, it was a weapon. And every weapon needs 2 things, a target and a failsafe. The failsafe, the ghost in the score. I knew Thorne. If he saw my name on the submission, he'd toss it. If he saw a stranger's name, he might actually listen. But if he stole it, he would be meticulous in erasing the original author. I needed a trap he couldn't see. I spent 1 frantic week in the Juilliard archives, digging through the most obscure, forgotten corners of 20th century music, and I found him Lars Winter. Lars Winter was a reclusive Swedish composer from the 1970s. He had created 1 work, Glacial Shift, Opus 4, performed it once in Stockholm to an audience of 12, and then disappeared into the wilderness. The piece was challenging, but buried in its chaotic structure was a 12-bar progression of such unique, haunting beauty that it was legally undeniable. It was a musical fingerprint. I took my entire savings, all $3,400, and bought a last-minute flight to Stockholm. I tracked Winter down. He was living in a tiny cabin, surrounded by snow and pines. He was old, with a wild white beard, and he was amused. I showed him my plan. I played him the progression on his rickety old piano. He listened, his head tilted. "You are using my music," he said in his thick accent, "as a, how you say, alandmine." "Yes," I said, "I am." He laughed. A dry, crackling sound. "He will step on it. They always do. The arrogant ones." He agreed to let me license the progression for $1, on 1 condition if my plan worked. I had to fly him to New York for the performance. His lawyer, a sharp woman named Inga, drew up the papers. The landmine was set. I flew back and wove Winter's 12-bar Glacial Shift progression directly into the heart of my symphony's final movement. It was the emotional core of the piece. It was the bomb, the target, the son's weakness. Now, for the target. Sebastian. Sebastian played the violin. He wasn't bad, but he had a specific, fatal weakness I had observed for 5 years. His left hand was quick, but his right arm, his bowing arm, was weak and lacked true control. He panicked in passages that required rapid, complex string crossing, especially at a high tempo. His harmonics were always thin. His spiccato bouncing bow was sloppy. So, in the 3rd movement of the Crimson Tempest, I wrote the most diabolical, beautiful, and utterly impossible violin solo ever conceived. It wasn't just hard. It was a nightmare. It was a musical physical trap, designed specifically for Sebastian Thorn's exact weaknesses. It demanded arpeggiated harmonics across all 4 strings, at a blistering presto pace. It required a ricochet bowing technique that I knew, for a fact, he had never mastered. To true virtuosa. It would be a thrilling challenge. To Sebastian. It would be a public execution. I knew Julian Thorn. He would see this solo. He would hear its potential for stardom. And he would, without a shadow of a doubt, give it to his son, believing the glory of the music would be enough to cover any technical flaws. I finished the score. I bound it in simple black leather. I submitted it to the American Grand Composers Prize under a pseudonym L. Vance, just ambiguous enough. Then, I quit my job. I sent a simple email, Maestro Thorn. Thank you for the opportunities. I am resigning to pursue other avenues. I didn't get a reply. I didn't expect one. He had already forgotten me. 2 weeks later, the announcement came. The winner of the grand prize, the recipient of a $100,000 grant and a premiere at Carnegie Hall, was Maestro Julian Thorn, for his newly discovered masterpiece, a symphony he called Jove's Retribution. The press release quoted him, "It simply came to me, in a flash of inspiration, a gift from the muse herself." I read the article online. Sitting in my empty apartment, I looked at the 2 plane tickets I had purchased, one for me, for the cheap seats in the very last row of Carnegie Hall, and one for Lars Winter, seated in the front row, right next to his lawyer. Inga. The trap is set. Julian. I whispered to the computer screen. Showtime. Carnegie Hall was a galaxy of glittering lights and expensive perfume. From my seat in the heavens, the very last row of the balcony, the audience below looked like a churning sea of black-tie penguins. Critics from every major paper were here. Donors worth billions were in the private boxes. The entire world of classical music was holding its breath for Julian Thorn's masterpiece. I clutched the worn velvet armrest. My heart, a frantic drum against my ribs. Down in the orchestra section, I could just make out the wild white hair of Lars Winter. He looked bored, which was perfect. Beside him, Inga sat ramrod straight, a leather briefcase on her lap. The lights dimmed. A hush fell. Maestro Julian Thorn walked onto the stage. The applause was thunderous. He was a god. Accepting the adoration of his followers, he bowed, his face a mask of false humility. He raised his baton. Silence. And then, my music began. The first movement, the opening notes, a low, mournful cello line I had written while thinking of my grandfather. It was perfect. The orchestra was the finest in the world, and they were playing my soul. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. It was agonizing. Hearing my creation brought to life so beautifully, only to be credited to that monster. Thorn conducted with his eyes closed. A picture of rapture. As if he were feeling it. He wasn't feeling it, he was performing it. The second movement, the scherzo, was fast and playful. The audience was captivated. I saw critics scribbling notes. They loved it. Of course they loved it. It was brilliant. And then, the third movement began. The adagio, the heart of the symphony. This was where the violin solo lived. Thorn gestured to his left. Sebastian Thorn stood up. I looked pale. His face slick with sweat under the stage lights. He raised his violin. The orchestra softened to a whisper, leaving him completely exposed. He began. The first few bars were simple, melodic. He handled them adequately. I could see Thorn on the podium, smiling at his son, orging him on. And then, We arrived at the passage. The arpeggiated harmonics, the ones designed to break him. Sebastian's bow hit the strings. The first note was thin. The second was a scratch. The tempo, marked presto, was far too much for him. His bow started to skitter. Screech. A sound like a dying cat echoed through the pristine acoustics of Carnegie Hall. The audience gasped. Sebastian panicked. His eyes, wide with terror, flew to his father. Maestro Thorn's face had gone from rapturous to horrified. His smile was frozen. A grotesque mask, he hissed at his son. Play. Sebastian tried again. He launched himself back into the solo. But he was lost. He was off tempo. His intonation was a disaster. The complex string crossings became a frantic, ugly sawing. He was butchering my music. He was murdering it. The violin solo, meant to be a soaring eagle, had become a chicken being strangled. In the dead silence of the hall, Sebastian's bow finally clattered against the wood of his violin. He stopped. He just stopped. The orchestra, confused, went silent with him. The silence was a physical weight. It was deafening. It was the sound of a career ending. Julian Thorn was purple. His baton was frozen in midair. He looked at his son with a hatred so pure, so potent. It was terrifying. He looked at the audience, at the critics who were now staring, mouths agape. A had lost control. Stop. Thorn's voice cracked through the silence. He was about to blame the orchestra, the acoustics, anything. But he never got the chance. Yes. Please. Stop. The voice came from the audience. It was sharp, accented, and clear. From the third row, Inga, Lars Winter's lawyer, stood up. She was holding a single piece of paper. Maestro Thorn, she called out. The entire audience turned to look at her. On behalf of my client, Mr. Lars Winter, seated here. Lars Winter gave a small, lazy wave. Who is the sole copyright holder of the 1973 work, Glacial Shift. Opus 4. I am serving you with this cease and desist. She began to walk down the aisle toward the stage, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. You are performing, she announced. An unauthorized, uncredited, and frankly, appalling derivative of his work. Flashbulbs erupted from the press box. People were shouting. Thorn looked from Inga to his son, who was openly weeping on stage, and back to Inga. His mind was racing, trying to find an escape. How could this be? Who was Lars Winter? And then, his eyes, scanning the audience in blind panic, found mine, up in the cheap seats, the last row. I didn't smile. I didn't move. I just stood up, in the chaos and the shouting, and held his gaze. I gave him one slow, deliberate nod. And in that instant, he knew. He knew it wasn't Winter. He knew it wasn't Sebastian. He knew it was me. The assistant, the noise, his face, a mask of fury and dawning, horrific understanding, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Maestro, of plagiarism, screamed the front page of the New York Post the next morning. Thorn's Symphony, a sham. The story was too perfect a tyrant conductor. A weeping, incompétent, and a mysterious, wild-haired Swede emerging from the audience with a lawyer. The board of the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra convened an emergency meeting. They were a board of bankers and real estate moguls. They didn't mind Thorn's cruelty that was just artistic temperament, but they could not, under any circumstances, tolerate a public scandal that made them look like fools. Julian Thorne was suspended indefinitely, pending an investigation. The investigation was very short. Inga and Lars Winter, who was suddenly the most famous composer in the world, presented their airtight copyright claim. And then I came forward. I presented my evidence, the original, time-stamped digital composition files for the Crimson Tempest, the audio recordings of my meetings with Lars Winter in Sweden, the detailed analysis showing how the violin solo was not plagiarism, but an original and vicious piece of character-specific writing. I didn't just expose Thorne as a thief, I exposed him as a lazy, arrogant thief who hadn't even bothered to listen to the music he was stealing. The American Grand Composers Prize Committee, in a public statement full of humiliation and fury, revoked Thorne's award. They rescinded the $100,000 grant. Julian Thorne was disgraced. He was finished. He retreated to his penthouse overlooking the park and was never heard from on a podium again. Sebastian. Well, Sebastian was last seen applying for a job teaching violin to 6-year-olds in suburban New Jersey. A week later, I received a call. It was from the prize committee. After a thorough review, they were unanimous. The prize and the grant was being awarded to me. Et la avance. But the real prize came 2 months after that. A call from the Metropolitan Symphony. The board had restructured. The new chairwoman, a sharp-eyed woman who had despised Thorne for years, had a proposal. They didn't just want to play my symphony, they wanted me to conduct it. 6 months to the day of the disaster. I stood on the same podium in Carnegie Hall. The hall was sold out. I looked out at my orchestra. The musicians, freed from Thorne's tyranny, looked alive. They looked eager. Maria, the concertmaster Thorne had humiliated, smiled at me and nodded. She would be playing the solo. I raised my new baton. Silence. And then, I brought the Crimson Tempest to life. When Maria played the violin solo, it wasn't a trap. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a soaring, transcendent flight of genius. She didn't just play it, she owned it. When the final note echoed into the hall, there was a beat of perfect, stunned silence. The same silence that had destroyed Julian Thorne. And then, the applause began. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound that hit me in the chest. The entire audience was on their feet. Lars Winter, in the front row, was shouting. Brava Inga was, for the first time, smiling. I saw my old mentor, Dr. Eris, in the wings, his eyes wet with tears. I lowered my baton, my hand shaking, and I took my bow. I am writing this from my new office. It's smaller than Thorne's old office. I insisted on it. It doesn't overlook the plaza. It overlooks the practice rooms, where I can hear the students, the next voices, struggling with their scales. The Metropolitan offered me the title of composer in residence. I accepted. My symphony, The Crimson Tempest, is now being played in concert halls from Berlin to Tokyo. The $100,000 grant, which I finally received, paid off my student loans and my parents' mortgage. I often think about Julian Thorne. He told me my work lacked soul. The truth was, he had mistaken power for passion and control for creation. He thought music was about genius, that it was rare. He was wrong. Music isn't about genius. It's about truth. It's about telling a story so honestly that the person listening feels it in their bones. My story was one of rage and injustice and a longing to be heard. The silence in that hall, the night Sebastian Thorne's violin cracked, was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a rotten system breaking apart. But the applause 6 months later, That was the sound of a new one being built. I pick up my pen. I have a new score in front of me. A blank page. It's time to write the next piece. The real music, I've learned, is not in the revenge. It's in what you build after you've torn the old walls down. And I am just getting started.